Butheina, you are obviously the founder of Cinema Akil. Who here has been to Cinema Akil? Okay, enough said.
Can I ask a different question?
Yes.
Who here has watched a film at Cinema?
So not just like chilled at the cafe or
taking pictures, which is great. I mean, that's what it is. It's supposed to be. It's a highly Instagrammable establishment.
Amazing. So I was thinking about this, and I've known about Cinema Akil for a long time. I've been there. I think it was one of the first places I visited when I moved here, and I was thinking about how do you, come up with an idea like that, like an art house cinema? Is it something that you grew up thinking about it? Were you always into film? Like, what's the backstory of how this happened? That was my first question.
So, I mean, I wish I had this sort of, very romantic story to share about, I grew up in a projector room, like Cinema Paradiso, I used to be through, and I've always wanted to do this here. But I think it was sort of there was a cruel process that went into the final sort of stage of having a brick and mortar art house cinema. There's nothing particularly original about, an art house cinema. It's something that's always existed. It's community cinema. It's cinema that is informed by, people that live around that space. It's a part of everyday life, in a lot of cities and villages and, communities. And, cinema, in a way, is, without sounding too abstract, this morning, is life itself, right? That's what film is, and that's why we've always relied and, sort of fed off of the process of cinema going, right? Beyond, that's the view of the sort of non-entertainment or escapist cinema. And I think, for me, it was always about the frustration around representation in film and in moving image. I've always sort of found myself at the intersection of, culture and the moving image, or documentary, and trying to program that. So I started this journey as a sort of a head of programming or acquisitions for a channel that was supposed to be launched back in 2008 here in Dubai. There was an organization called Arab Media Group, and they had done this partnership deal with Viacom for MTV and Nickelodeon Arabia. And I go in there, I'm 23 at the time, and I show up with this deck, like really excited to, present to the CEO, like the kind of gusto that I had at the time. I'm like, what was I thinking? But somehow, because it was a crazy time in Dubai, it did. And the whole idea was that why don't we have a version of a Sundance channel, or a ZDF or an Arte, or an IFC version that sort of represents what's going on here. And looking back, I don't know how many of you have been in Dubai, that long, but that was the moment where, there were crazy things happening on the cultural, and creative landscape. There was the Universal Museums project. There was the Dubai Pearl that's now finally being resuscitated. There was a lot of things so all of the stuff that we know now, or when I walk around Zakat Avenue, a lot of that was still in abstract, or there were like pockets of galleries that were showing off. There was Brown Book around at the time. So there was a lot of creative energy that didn't have a space to be, harnessed. And a big part of that was film. So we had the Dubai International Film Festival, the Abu Dhabi Film Festival later, the Gulf Film Festival. But that was like, 10-day spans at the end of the year that, you would have to try and like ration, the 200-something, films within different spaces and, Mall the Emirates and navigating all that. So the idea was, why not have a space that, continuously projects and shows and presents these films back to us on free-to-air television, because that was still a thing at the time. I mean, it's still a thing, actually, in this region.
The television.
I mean, yeah, like it's changing, but free-to-air is still kind of the dominant sort of, media, media space for the region. And, that's the space that I was trying to infiltrate with this idea. And so we got funding, we started producing, I started acquiring films. So I learned the sort of, distribution circuit through that process. And the first film that we bought, and I always get goosebumps thinking about it, was was Anne-Marie Jas's Lama Shufta. Salt of the Sea. Her first feature film, and we had Saleh Bakri, the actor, in the cinema a week ago. And there's like this full circle moment, and it keeps happening. With this project, and so we bought all these films. It was supposed to go up on free to air. Financial crisis, you all know the rest, and the whole company was restructured, and this project never saw the light of day. So I had this sort of literally a suitcase, of screeners and films that we had licensed, and these relationships that I had built over the process of working there that I felt responsible for. I wanted to sort of flip the table and do it in a completely different sort of grassroots format where I could get permission to show these films to an audience of 20-something, in something called The Shelter, if you remember The Shelter in Ethos. And that's how it started. That's how my journey of like putting these screenings up.
So it was like pop-ups.
It was pop-up, but it wasn't called Cinema Akil. It was just me wanting to bring these films home. It's like, you gotta see this. Like, that was the whole, and this is pre like, here's a screener link, or here's a, just check it out on Netflix. So that was, and the other dimension that I always believed in was the community part. There was always some sort of like spatial aspect of bringing bodies together around these conversations and letting the film sort of tell the stories that, that frame the way that we connect to each other. So that was sort of a lot of the foundational thinking around it, but it wasn't Cinema Akil, it wasn't, a brand per se, it was just screenings. And then, a few years later, I kept doing these in like pockets. I went away, I came back, and by the time I came back, it was 2013, and it made sense. Like this was the time that Dubai really felt like it was ready, to have a space like this, to have a space that any day of the week you could walk in and watch these films. And there was also a growing frustration with, the absence of a film festival at the time. So that's when I started Cinema Akil as an actual. Our first screening was at something called the Third Line Gallery, which you might know, in its older space, which is now a belly dancing studio. Across the street, funny enough, like there we have a big window in the cinema that overlooks that space. So there's this weird, like, kind of tethering effect.
Double performance.
Yeah. And now Third Line is like down the street from us. So there is this very kind of community-driven sort of ethos to the project. And so we did a pop-up there. It was the first proof of concept. Beanbags, Manouja Street, a really like terrible office projector, and the films, because we had those relationships. I had those relationships with the filmmakers, and we ran this series, which was films by the artists from the Third Line and feature films that were sort of a smorgasbord or a tasting menu of what kind of film we would want to, in theory, present in a fully fledged art house. And that was our first sort of trial. And sure enough, like it was a summer, and we ran it for 6 weeks, and every single time it was packed. Every single time people were scrambling for seats. So there was something about that momentum that really, drove me to take this, to another level. We continued doing pop-ups, and I think that was as frustrating as the experience was, and as challenging as it was, going from like 3 contractors and different architects in this space, this warehouse. There was something extremely informative and gratifying, and now sort of essential to who we are as a space and as an idea, that really informed the way that we ended up building the space. Ended up thinking about our programming that we wouldn't have learned if I started it immediately as an art house space, as a brick and mortar establishment. And it also allowed us to reach different communities, to travel. We would do screenings all over the UAE. So we did. I think at this point we must have done like 75 pop-ups in that whole journey, and ranging from a 5-seater, black box cinema in Maraya Art Center in Sharjah to 1,500 city concerts in D3. So we did a broad range, of different types of, and we learned about, why, what people are interested in, what they're yearning for, what makes them cry, what seats they hate.
What seats do they hate?
Our seats. I mean, we have 2 different types of seats. I can talk a little bit more about this later, but we're working on it.
Okay. No, I did want to actually hear more about, because it is a very when you walk in, I mean, whoever's been there, it is a very startling place, right? You're not expecting it. You're in Nasrkal, everything's very pristine, perfect, you know, the perfect sign, perfect floors, and then you walk into cinema, you also don't just like walk in. There's also this pathway, and you open the door and you walk in. My first reaction was like, what is this? Like, how did I find this? And of course, everyone else had found it. It wasn't my secret gem. But it feels like that. It feels like, oh, I just discovered something that is really special. So I wanted to know more about like how that came about, what are those chairs? Like,
what are those uncomfortable chairs?
Yeah, there's a lot of designers, I'm sure. And
the most thing I love about cinema is the chairs.
Me too. So, honestly, I don't know how you're talking about
it. You get the best chair. Okay, so I mean, I don't know where to start with this design process because it feels like it had like multiple lifetimes. So originally, we weren't even supposed to be at at the location we're in right now. We're always going to be in Sakal, and that speaks to the sort of value of working with partners that really see, the sort of have the same buy-in in terms of the importance that a cinema would play in a space like it. And they were just launching their new purpose-built warehouses section. And if you've been to Sakal, there's a part of it that's the older warehouses that used to be mostly, whether it's auto workshops or uniform factory or fire retardant suppliers or whatever. And then the other side was sort of made for the creative community. That was the pitch, and it made sense for us to be there. There was the right mix. A lot of the galleries are being sort of consolidated, in the space, and they had a belief in public programming. So we started working together way before we decided to have a space in terms of activating their outdoor cinema, the yard, doing screenings, throughout the year that are public screenings, and it really made sense, in terms of wanting to be there. But we were supposed to be like in a warehouse right opposite the yard, right there. It was supposed to be central. We had the completely different design that was informed by, what I think of as sort of a universal art house language. Whether it's the neon, whether it's the the type of like hand cut marquee, whether it's the type of chairs, whether it's the velvet curtains. Like there's certain things that are kind of part of this checklist of art house cinemas, and I spent a lot of time like just nerding out on every art house that I can get my hands on all over the world. Wherever I would travel, wherever I would find myself, I'd go find seeking out like what are these cinemas and what do they have in common. And so at some point, after doing that exercise and working with two architects, there was something that just wasn't working. There was something inauthentic, about trying to force a design, on a dynamic that was, for the longest time, very fluid, and very informal. So what I said was, at this point, we've been doing pop-ups for a long time. We've been, doing free programming. Let's try our hand at this. Let's do a POC. Let's do a run, sort of a dry run of a very, whittled down version of what a full-time space would look like, and try to sell tickets and see if people would come on a daily basis. Because it's no longer eventized. It's no longer, you're coming to one shot to watch, to watch a Wong Kar-wai film. Like this is gonna run for a week. Are people gonna continuously, stream through? Is that appetite really there? And I needed to know at that point. I needed to know because it was always like, we're gonna get there. That's the end game. And we took over and thanks to to the partnership with Al-Zakar, they believed in the project enough to work with us on this, and we took over the space that we were in. It was Chalanpur. It was fitted out for with a temporary AC for a pop-up that ran during Ramadan, and we just took it and took that setup. And the brief was, you guys can do anything in the space, but don't drill a single nail into the wall. So everything had to sort of float off the structure. And this is summer, so we're working with this temporary AC in an aluminum, a steel structure, and we had to make it work. And there was a giant window. That was the other design challenge, that there was this giant window that was there, so we couldn't program to anything. Yeah. Exactly. Projector, So we had a projector for the outdoor space, and I worked with, I enlisted the sort of the force field that is, the duo, the dynamic duo, Chef Moha and and Jindi, who were starting their design practice at the time, and they were photographers and artists and I mean, right now they're superstars, but at the time they really were really just were interested in doing something like this, and it was the summertime, so people had the sort of appetite to stay here, and we brainstormed, thought about what does space look like, how do we even get chairs, we don't have chairs, how do we create the space within this shell, and I mean, there's a video that I can send a link to, which sort of they documented the process of building the cinema in 8 days, and it was a kind of a prototype really for what we ended up with. There were sort of some adjustments that we got real chairs, and the wallpaper is from that era. This wall wasn't there. We had this sort of, it was still the tunnel effect. We had the box office at the front, and everything in that space was sort of an effort of, I really think it's I call it the house that love built, because that's what it is. That's what made it happen. It was people that wanted, and friends, that came together in, at like 12 midnight, and they were just like, we paste the wall, or rearrange the chairs, and so, and partners donating. So we did a call for chairs and seats and and anything that you could donate. And people from everywhere started, sending us like, oh, come, we have this extra armchair. Oh, I have this sofa. And so it was like a mishmash of furniture that ended up becoming this space. This is not that same collection, but that's how we managed to make it happen. It was because of this sort of shared belief that we needed space like this, and these are the moments that that kept this assumption alive and fueled. So that space went on for 3.5 months in the summer, and we ran it every single day. We didn't even have physical tickets. We didn't have a POS system. It was like hand drawn, tickets, and you would get and we couldn't sell tickets officially, so we would sell you a box of biscuits as your ticket. So there was a lot of that sort of makeshift solutions, but that's, I guess, the thing that made it really, I think, the moment of realization, for what we need to do here. Obviously, we no longer sell cookies as tickets.
I feel like that's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a concept. But now we actually need to sell the cookies to keep the space going. That's the ugly side of going full time. But I think it really, like, it was the one thing that kept coming up. Like, people were finding out about us. We didn't even have a sign. It was like this sort of hidden corner, in Al Sakan. It wasn't as populated. It wasn't as as pristine, as you put it, as it is today. And we had people like who would fly in from Saudi Arabia, and come in and like, oh, I heard about this thing that you're doing. Like, I want to check it out. And then there were people who were just really interested in the films. And we opened with Alexander McQueen, the documentary, and a film called In the Last Days of the City, آخر أيام المدينة, by an Egyptian director called Tamer Said, who had spent 7 years working on this film. And it's a beautiful film, an ode to Cairo's sort of lost memories of the architectural. It's an architectural film. Like, that's how I see it. It is about the revolution. It is about about the story of this filmmaker who's trying to get his film made. So it's also like a sort of a autobiography. But yeah, we opened with that, and I mean, I didn't expect people to know about this, other than Tamer's friends in the bar, or people who'd been following the news. And we opened doors, and it was a full house from day one. I'm sorry, no, it wasn't McQueen. McQueen was the opening of the full-time space. It was I Am Not Your Negro by Raoul Peck. And that film had already made headways, and it was incredible to see people's interest and reactions and conversations that were happening. And the one thing that kept coming back, is please don't change this. Like, don't fix it. Don't make it better. And I knew this in the back of my mind, the sort of betting on the imperfection, which is the sort of the ethos of the space, because that's what it is. That's what films are, and that's what the stories are. It's about our imperfections, and that's what makes us be able to tell those stories and live those lives. And that was kind of an aha moment where when we started to work on the permanent space and this proof of concept work. I mean, our closing film was Loving Vincent, which was, this is August, right? No, so this is September, first week of September in Dubai, in Asakal, surrounded by like steel and concrete. And we had lineups that extended all the way to the gate. It was like 500 people lined up for this film. And the space, I mean, before it used to fit 100 people. So this was just this kind of magical, crazy moment that, told us a lot about what kind of space we need to create. So it took us about a year to fix what needed to be fixed, to get better chairs. So the chairs, the story of the chairs, going back to that, is at the time there was also a demolition project underway of the last standing. It wasn't an art house, but a last standing, standalone cinema in Dubai called the Golden Cinema, which used to be called the Plaza Cinema. And there's an artist called Ammar Ata, a photographer, who's actually documented that whole process and actually, collected a lot of the materials from the cinema. And we went in there, and at that time, by the time that I got in there, a lot of the seats had already been ripped apart and stripped for metals. But there was the balcony upstairs, and this is a huge space. It's a 1,000-seater cinema with a balcony, which is how cinemas were primarily in the 70s, 80s, and up to the mid 90s. And there were these balcony seats that were still intact, and they were plastic and upholstered fabric. And we went in there and just asked the demolition company if we could buy them.
Wow.
So that's what we did. We stripped out whatever we can, whatever we could salvage. Obviously, we upholstered the seats for hygiene, and those are the seats that you see on the right and left. And it's in a way, it's not just the sort of nostalgia or the sentimentality, but it's also an act of sort of preservation and connecting even myself with this project to being from the city and what that trajectory looks like, because now they all don't exist. They all exist in Ammar's own personal archive, or in Hind Mazena's piece on Asakal.online about the history of cinema. But that's pretty much it. Like that language didn't exist, and I referred to a lot of that cinema language of that era when building the space and when making decisions about it. And so we have a little bit of that history in the space, and the rest of the seats were donated from the Global Art Global Art Forum seats. We reupholstered them. The idea was this, seat doubling down on the sea of red, so we just refined the design from there.
Yeah. I feel like if you tell people who are complaining about the seats that story, they're more appreciative about it.
I'm gonna give it a shot. There's something about charging really people for things.
Yeah.
I will always give you a review. The other thing was the big decision that I made was that the majority of the investment that I'm going to make in this was going to go towards the AV. Was going to go towards getting the best possible, cinema grade, DCI compliant, projector and sound system, because that is the sort of, at the end of the day, all of the the aesthetics and the experience and the community is aside. That's what we're doing. We have to build a space that really respects the films that we're putting up and respects the filmmakers that have spent their time and lives making those films and getting them to us. And I think that was something that I didn't want to compromise on. So thankfully it's paid off.
Maybe. Yes.
Yeah. I love hearing about how cinema feels to life, and that there's so much passion and determination to make it what it is today. For me, I wonder why cinema? Like, what drew you to cinema? What's film cinema
How do you answer? Probably it's Ethos. And there's a filmmaker that I love called Jibril Mambeti Diop, a Senegalese filmmaker that said cinema is magic in the service of dreams. And I always sort of find myself going back to that, because there's something about the way that, there's a sort of a conscious kind of political, intentional dimension to and social dimension to the films that we show. It's not just cinema as an art form. And then there's the poetic. So there's the sort of, like ruthlessly pragmatic side of being at the cusp of, the arts and culture and doing that work and being in the entertainment business, and this is what cinema is and this is what attention is. But the kind of decisions that went into, building a space like this, focusing on art house, focusing on the films that don't have, wide distribution channels for the most part, focusing on films from the region. And when I say region, the larger sort of Swana region. Those are sort of, very conscious decisions on wanting to see people that, that sound and look like the people in this community. I think this is the thing that I miss the most, is that, the access that we have to film was primarily defined by what, Hollywood, Bollywood, Mollywood, sometimes Bollywood, were putting up on screens here, in the multiplexes. And I feel like there was a responsibility, that I had to bring those films back and bring those films home. And, there's something about seeing yourself on, on the big screen, seeing your mother's, voice reflected in a story that meeting people that are in your community through this very specific, sort of story through which you reveal universal about their worlds. And this is not about like messaging per se, right? It's a sort of the invisibilia that permeates what cinema does. It's what Roger Ebert calls life itself, and that's I guess a long answer to your question.
Long and beautiful. Yeah.
Hi. I'm just kind of following up on that because for me, I remember I was there for Real Palestine for a few years. That was also a lot of fun, especially when they did it outdoors and we'd run out of seats, so they would bring out rugs and people would just sit on the floor. It just shows you how much demand and hunger there is for seeing representation, so to speak, right? Same thing, I know a few months ago you had a pop-up in ICD Brookfield in the IFC, and I was there. And for me, that really resonated because I'm Saudi, and the movie, while it was shot over here, it was a story about this 3-generation Saudi family going to some farm in the desert, and their exploits and all that stuff was hilarious. So for me, it's always interesting whenever I'm watching these cultural independent films, the amount of dark humor that is actually in there. It's really refreshing to see a different perspective, right? And seeing different cultures besides, like you said, the mainstream representation cliches that you see. So for me, that's the value that I find in the movies that cinema actually brings. But since you mentioned a little bit earlier, have you noticed any disruption when it comes to now the streaming platforms coming in? And are they in any way disrupting, or is it what you're giving, is it just an experience and it's a different experience?
Thank you for sharing that about, before we forget, Nawaf Janat's latest film. And that's sort of part of this disruptive moment now that we're living, of the emergence of Saudi cinema and everybody wanting to make Saudi films, and films that are made specifically for VOD distribution that have a very short theatrical lifespan, go immediately to the streamers. And in a way, I mean, that's what you said. I just want to reflect on something that you said about the importance of of seeing a different perspective. Is that there is something about a moment of sort of empowerment, reclamation, anger, even, that comes out of the process of seeing your story, seeing a world that being represented by somebody who's had that experience that defies what you've always seen of yourself and your community on screen, right? So last week we had the Arab Cinema Week, which was our first edition, and we had a film called The Gravedigger's Wife, or Zawjat Hafar al-Qubur, by Khadr Aidarus Ahmed, a Somali Finnish filmmaker, and he shot most of the film in Djibouti. And he was saying that for the longest time, like what you had of Somali cinema and image making was Captain Phillips. You had, that's the image, and those, as funny as we find it, like those are the things that remain. Those are the things that define, that justify, warfare. Like that's how powerful this work is. And I'm not saying that the gravedigger's wife is suddenly going to make everything better, but it just does change your relationship to a place and a people. And the film is about this love story. It's this guy who's a gravedigger whose wife is dying, and he has to find a way of of raising enough money to save her. And you see a beautiful story of Somali love, Somali romance, Somali intimacy, and it's just it completely like changes the way that you understand the place, or even understand yourself, because a majority of the audience was Somali that maybe grew up here in the UAE, or we're transiting through, and that's what this work is, right? And that's what Real Palestine, Another Dimension, is about resistance through cinema. And that's important work as well, right? Is that you don't have spaces where you understand the complexities, of the real politics, the beyond social media and beyond all of these different pockets and ways of accessing, and obviously through people having a direct relationship to Palestine in the UAE. And this is the other thing about being here, the specificity of being here, is that you have people from all these experiences, and not that they came, or they're not just like immigrants that moved to Canada or the US that have that kind of relationship, which Rami speaks to and Mo speaks to. These are communities that have, their aunt came last week, they have a very direct relationship to the place. They go and visit, so it's a very, transient and also rooted kind of experience and reality. So anyway, going back to the streamers, it is a consideration. I mean, it's not something I can't, it's not, I would love to say, yes, I romanticize the cinema as being this, this eternal or infinite, medium by which to access film and cinema. But I think what, at least the cinema Akil experience tells me, is the importance of this, right? And this is what we are betting on. It's not just accessing films. We do show films that have been released already on Shahid, or available on Shahid, or Netflix, or whatever. But it's about coming to a space together, this shared darkness that I sometimes talk about, the encounter with the filmmaker when we have the luxury of doing that, to really understand what they're trying to say, and maybe through that understanding, you take away some of that in your work, whether you're a creative or a designer, or a filmmaker yourself, or you're a commercial photographer, or even an investment banker. What you see in the space in that particular moment, in the uninterrupted. So we were talking about this earlier, the sort of uninterrupted act of surrendering to the editorial voice of the film is very different. It's very conscious. You are electing, to come and share your time and be there and not be disrupted and not have the ability to pause, and not be on your phone, even though some people always are. But that's the difference, I think. And we work in parallel. We work in parallel. Sometimes we do day and date releases. Sometimes we'll show films before they go to VOD, and we demand that depending on the film. And sometimes we'll bring back a film that's been released online, because also, as great as Netflix has been, or whatever all the other streaming platforms have been for for making some of the shows, at least, that have introduced a new language, like Butheina Kazim or whatever. They're still, you're still a category. You're still Middle Eastern films, and there's no context, there's no respect even, for the film. So I think this is our job. This is what we do, and it's a continuity.